Hello, lovely people. We are up to American Gothic episode 17, Learning to Crawl, which is it's kind of a locked room type of episode, but it has an Evil Dead link. So Sam Raimi worked on the Evil Dead, and he worked on this series as well. And Ted Raimi, his brother, is one of the main characters in this episode. So let's get into it. So I don't know why, but the opening, like, Caleb is working in the sheriff's office, like cleaning the roof, like mopping the ceiling. It's really weird, but apparently that's a job that needs to be done. And I don't know, I guess it's like a, you know, kind of like mowing someone's lawn, like a weekend job for a kid. It's just kind of odd because I'm like, I don't know why he suddenly, anyway, he's like really chummy with the sheriff in this episode, so I don't know. But yeah, it's funny. Deputy Ben is there, and he sort of trips over the bucket, and Caleb makes a joke like, "Hey, you really kicked the bucket," and he's like, never heard of that expression apparently. But the water on the floor means that Caleb accidentally gets electrocuted, and in the hospital he has an out-of-body experience with like CGI clouds and stuff. It's I was thinking, like, it's such a bad special effect, but it was probably really expensive at the time, you know? But I don't know. It's got that dinky kind of 90s-ness that I love. So Merlin turns up, and she says that his death is part of God's plan, but she kind of screws up a little bit. She doesn't mention that he has a choice and that he can either stay or go back. And the sheriff appears in the clouds as well in the afterlife to tell him that he can go back into his body. So I think this undermines his trust a little bit with Merlin, but Merlin is just scared that if Caleb goes back, he's going to fall under the power of the sheriff and that kind of thing. So on returning, the sheriff has an idea to take him on a little break, and they're going to go on a fishing trip, which I think is kind of funny because obviously the sheriff has a plan here, and it's not fishing. Or not literally fishing anyway, fishing for something. They kind of have some interesting chats in the car. Caleb doesn't really wear many stripes in this episode. The sheriff tells him like a scary story about a monster in the woods. There's a little moment where they pull Selena over, and she has this cute leopard print swing coat. And the sheriff and she like kind of spar over whether Selena has a date with Dr. Peel or not. The sheriff's basically just messing with her, but he kind of ends up tricking her into thinking that Peel is going to stand her up. So she drives off, they reach the cabin, and meanwhile, there are some kidnappers. So there's Ted, Cody, and I couldn't catch the woman's name, so there's three. And Ted has these like John Lennon glasses on. It's like yeah. Anyway, he's one of three people who've kidnapped a tobacco executive to extort money, and the girl says she feels like this job like is different, like something's not right about it. So she's married to one guy, and Ted is that guy's brother. So that's the connection between three of them. Yeah, so back at the cabin, the guy that they've taken captive is talking back, and he sort of makes a run for it, tries to make a break for it, and Ted shoots him in the back. So when the sheriff reaches the cabin, it's the cabin where Ted is inside with the body of this guy. So it's like classic day out for the sheriff. This is like how he loves to spend his time off. And yeah, it's the cabin from Evil Dead, which I'm like, this is so exciting. Because I don't know, I just think that's cool. And yeah, so when they get there, Ted pulls a gun. The sheriff's super chilled. I love this setup. I'm like excited about where they're gonna go with this, because you know the sheriff's like in control and has some kind of like plan for this situation. So Ted finds out that the sheriff is law enforcement, and Buck knows that his name is Ted, so it's fun and games immediately. And then I was thinking, so he must be literally taking Caleb to the Evil Dead cabin. Like, do you know what I mean? Like, his weekend away is to take Caleb to the Evil Dead cabin. Like, and he says it's his cabin, I think. So then I'm like, I remember in the Evil Dead movie, like, kind of off the top of my head, it was like their weird uncle's cabin, and he had like those books in the basement of the cabin. And I'm like, so is Buck, Sheriff Buck, actually like the owner of the cabin from Evil Dead? Like, is it the same story universe? I don't know. I kind of think it might be. Anyway, he basically disarms Ted, and they find the body. And actually, just to go back, that would actually make sense because Ted Raimi, who plays Ted, is I think he's like a creature in Evil Dead like 1 and 2. So I'm like, bum bum bum. Yeah, so this is all meant to be a learning curve for Caleb, like little lessons that the sheriff's trying to teach him. So the sheriff points out that Ted would have been successful if he'd either not been a criminal at all or just had no conscience at all. So he's like doing things by halves, and that gets you into trouble, apparently. So the other two, meanwhile, have realized that the money drop isn't coming, and they head back to the cabin. They see the sheriff's car, they shoot at the cabin. They decide to come back after dark, and the lady of the group, she's like, we'll just kill all of them. And I'm like, this is like Sheriff Buck's ideal woman. Anyway, then Selena turns up at the cabin as well. She's looking for Peel because she thinks that he's on a fishing trip with them. And the sheriff admits that he basically set her up because he knew that that would make her come out to the cabin. He basically just wants to mess with her. I think he's a bit jealous. But I think he's also using her as like an instructional, you know, don't end up like Selena kind of thing to Caleb. The sheriff kind of starts messing with the kidnappers at this point. So he tells the kidnappers outside that he has the money to like get them stirred up. So when the Cody approaches, he just immediately disarms him, and he makes sure Caleb is watching them make a deal. The sheriff wants the man to take the money and leave the wife and brother behind. So the brother is Ted, that's in the cabin. And yeah, basically it's a how-to for Caleb. And let's see. So the sheriff kind of does a thing with Ted so that he sees what he did to the victim over and over. That's the guy that he shot in the back, the kidnapping victim. And the sheriff sends 10-year-old Caleb out into the night to talk to the lady kidnapper. She turns a gun on him, but he's like, hey, do you want to come inside and have a sandwich? It's funny. Caleb has sort of been sent out there on a mission by the sheriff, and he's told Caleb to tell her that Ted has gone to like a clearing with no gun, and that her husband is there digging up the loot or something. So he also tells her that the husband knows about the two of them. So basically the woman has been sleeping with both brothers. Yeah, he uses a kid. Like, this woman's planning on shooting him. So Selena's like kind of points out that this is not very nice. And the sheriff says he was perfectly safe the whole time. And then he has this whole big speech about how love makes you stupid and romantic love is just an addiction. And he's just kind of mad at Selena for being happy, basically. Cody's out in the woods digging, and his wife confronts him. She ends up shooting him, and he takes the bag of money that he dug up, but it's actually just full of rocks. So she goes back to the cabin. And this is where Sheriff does something interesting. He confers with Caleb, trying to get him to be like, what do you think we should do? You know, like, so that he'll think more like he does. So he gets Caleb to visualize, and he uses some kind of powers that we sort of had a hint that Caleb had some kind of powers, but we don't know what they are. But now we see him learning to use them. So I guess that's where the title comes from, learning to crawl. He's getting like baby steps into the dark arts. So yeah, he uses powers he didn't know he had, and he sends a vision of Ted out there. So the woman is like, oh, you're here. And then she kisses him, and then he turns into her husband's corpse, and she's all freaked out. And Selena is the voice of reason and humanity, and kind of says to Caleb, like, you shouldn't hurt people. Like, it's not good to hurt people, even if they're not nice people, or you think they're not nice people, you know? Just kind of warning him, I guess. Then later he uses his vision again to call up the monster that that the sheriff described in the car, like earlier in the episode. And yeah, he gets it to attack the woman out in the woods, which is pretty dark, I guess. And yeah, I mean, it's kind of a little bit reminiscent of Evil Dead, that, you know, she's out there and there's something like kind of out in the trees, like moving towards her, if you remember how some of the scenes were shot in that movie. So that's all. I don't know, I just think it's cool. I like the Evil Dead connection. I think it's really fun. There's a little scene earlier where Gale wants Ben to get someone to check on Caleb. He's just a bit like worried about the sheriff being alone with him in the woods, kind of thing. Like, I don't know. But Peel is there, and he's like, hey, like, let's both drive out there, because he's worried about Selena because she wasn't at her place. And he's a nice guy. He knows that something's up. Ben kind of warns them that the sheriff and Selena are like, you're not going to get between the two of them. Like, they're very, I don't know, they might have other relationships sometimes, but they always end up back together, basically. They end up just driving all night. They can't find the place. And oddly, like, Gale defends the sheriff. So she kind of slut shames Selena, which was a little bit surprising, and is like, I don't care about the sheriff's past. And Peel is really nice. He's like, well, I don't care about Selena's past. Like, I don't, you know, he doesn't look at women that way, I guess, like, as being pure or impure or whatever. Like, you know, he sees her for the other side of herself that we maybe don't see as much, the vulnerable side. I think that's cool. And it's weird that Gale defends the sheriff. Anyway, they finally make it to the cabin at the end of the episode. By then it's daylight. The sheriff is packing up Ted to arrest him. Kayla's packing up the fishing gear. And then the woman appears and attacks Selena. So she asks Caleb to help her and to kill the woman. And the sheriff's like watching, like, okay, Caleb, like, use your powers and like kill the woman. But instead he takes the gun from her hand gently. Like, he uses persuasion, I guess, to get her to defuse the situation safely, which is interesting. Yeah, so when Peel and Gale finally arrive, the deputies are there, and Gale says something like that she was worried about Caleb and that's why she's there, and Caleb kind of gives her a piercing glance, which he's so good at, and he says no, she wishes that she had been there and that's why she drove out there, so she's not fooling him. So yeah, it's a super cool episode. Maybe one of my sort of favorites so far, probably just because of the Evil Dead connections. It's kind of like made me think about a bunch of layers, and I kind of worry, maybe worry is like a strong word because these are fictional characters, but I'm kind of like, oh no, like, I don't want Caleb to turn out to be a bad guy. But yeah, each time something comes up, he seems to kind of resist, so it's interesting.